blessing to see a few visitors, and also like to just remind everybody to keep. We have a few out today, not doing well. You know, I want to cover the feast, but one of the things I don't know if you noticed or not, but it was a great feast in way of sickness. There just wasn't a whole lot of sickness this year. I think the sickness held off until after the feast. I know several are not doing well now, so if we can just keep the local assembly in prayer and pray for those not feeling well. Again, I want to just sort of give a review of the feast. You know, we had great messages, great fellowship, and of course, great food. We served almost every meal, and that was quite a challenge for some of the local folks here, and also for those who pitched in and helped. But the food was phenomenal. The fellowship was great. Many different activities, and I thought really it went off without a hitch. I know we were a bit concerned about some parking and different things, and it was the largest feast we've had to date, by the way, so it was just a terrific turnout, but everything went really smooth. There wasn't really too many issues, so just a tremendous blessing in that way. We had 24 states represented, and so that was quite a blessing to see so many people here, so many states represented. Also, we had folks from Canada, of course, and Kenya, and Nigeria. And that was quite a treat. As brother and sister, I can say brother and sister now because they were immersed, Sam and Elizabeth from Nigeria. They came all the way to be here. And I know it was quite a task for them to make the journey. So as I conveyed to them, I dropped them off at the airport when they left. And such a honor and privilege to have them, and really everybody here. It was just a great feast. I think we're worn out. Some of us are still worn out. We're recouping from the feast, but it was a great time. We also had 8 baptisms, so that was a blessing to see. And again, including those from Nigeria, the Nigerian couple. But just a terrific feast. And I anticipate a great feast next year, maybe a little bit larger than what we had this year. And we'll make some changes, but it's going to be some great time this year, and I anticipate a great feast next year here at this ministry. Well, you know, with the year's feast now being passed, I thought I would spend some time this Sabbath looking at the calendar. This week, we're able to finish our dates. We will confirm those. I want to begin with those 2018 feast dates. So here they are. So as you see, one of the things, they're going to be a little bit earlier this year than they were this year. Passover Memorial would be the March 31st. That'll be the evening of, by the way. Some people are confused. You know, is that day? Is that evening? It's Passover Memorials when we actually do it. Feast of Unleavened Bread actually starts April the 1st, that evening, but April 2nd through the 8th. We have Feast of Weeks, May 27th. Feast of Trumpets, September 11th. Atonement, Yom Kippur, the 20th. And Tabernacles will be the 25th of September through October 1st. And of course, the last great day then is October 2nd. One of the great things about next year, if you probably haven't yet because most of you haven't seen the calendar, but there's no issues, should be no issues at all with the 1st and 7th new moons, which will be very nice. So these days should be fairly solid. You know, sometimes we just don't know. There's that new moon that we just can't really project completely. But these new moons are fairly old, so it should be no issues with the new moons as it pertains to the feast days next year. I want to talk real quickly about this May 27th date. I've noticed a few differences amongst some of the other assemblies. I want to explain real quickly why we do this. I don't have a calendar. I'm not going to explain the calendar, but the scripture says that we're to begin the count to the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost. It says the morrow after the Sabbath, the morrow after the Sabbath. So as we understand that, the morrow after the Sabbath is Sunday. So it's like saying the day after Wednesday. What's the day after Wednesday? Day after Wednesday is Thursday. Same thing. So morrow after the Sabbath is not Sabbath, it's Sunday. Does that make sense? So that's how we count to Pentecost. It's the day after the morrow, or the morrow after the Sabbath, I should say. And that is Sunday. And since unleavened bread is the feast that commemorates the barley harvest, that has to land within unleavened bread. So that's how we count. It's a Sunday within unleavened bread. And scripture says you have to have 7 complete weeks, so it's 49 days. And then you have a 50th day, and so it always lands on Sunday. So anyway, that's how we determine that. You may see some differences this year because of the Sabbath. But May 27th is the Feast of Weeks, and there's the other days as well. Also, we should have the wall calendar online now, so that should be available. If you want a copy of that, you can go online and request one, or probably just talk to Debbie. I don't know if we have them printed yet, but we will, I'm sure, real soon. Now, again, with all this in mind, I thought today I would review the biblical calendar. Real basic review for most of us, because, most of us, we know this, but some people, they're still coming to this truth. This is new. We had a lot of new people this year, by the way, the feast, which was a tremendous blessing. A lot of new people, they're trying to figure this stuff out. So again, today we're going to go through this. And really what we're going to focus on is how we determine the biblical day, month, and year. So most of us, again, we have this under our belt, but we're going to do this anyway. So for many, it's going to be a review, but reviews aren't always a bad thing. So how do we do this? How do we begin the biblical day, the biblical month, and the biblical year? And is this important? Or, it's critically important, I believe, because, Yahweh commands that we observe his days at specific times. For example, we know that the Passover is on the 14th day of Abib. The feast begins on the 15th, and so on and so forth. We have many, many cases where Yahweh says, you shall do this on this month, on this day. And we're going to see later with the Day of Atonement that, if you don't do it on that day, that there are some repercussions for that. Now, for those who don't understand that, believe me, we're not condemning those who don't understand it, but for those who do, it's important that we get it right. Because again, it impacts Yahweh's worship. Same way with the Sabbath. We don't worship on Sunday, we worship on Saturday. We worship on the seventh day, because this is what Yahweh says to do within his word. Now, as a side note, we know that the modern Jewish calendar, we're seeing that more and more, is not the same as the biblical calendar. Some people, they just assume, or it's a Jewish calendar, it has to be right. Or if you're assuming that, you're not right, you're assuming wrong. It is not the same. And we know that there's many discrepancies or differences between the Jewish calendar and the biblical calendar. I want to share with you a chart. Of course, I'm going to give away some of the information here doing this, but that's fine. So here's a chart from the Restoration, a study Bible. I've done some reformatting, but this is all the content. So here's, it says biblical calendar versus a Jewish calendar. So here's some of the differences or discrepancies between the two. So number one, the biblical calendar is based on observation. It's based on observation only. We'll talk about more about that as we go on. Jewish calendar is based completely today on calculation. Now that was a progress, by the way. Did not happen immediately. They began adding calculations, and now it's just a completely calculated calendar, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. The biblical calendar begins in the year, in the spring, with the confirmation of the Abib barley. We'll look at that in depth, Exodus 9:31 and also Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. The Jewish calendar, though, begins in the fall with the fall equinox, the autumnal equinox, and then they count backwards. So that's how that works, completely foreign and distinct from what Scripture shows. The Bible verifies that each month begins with the first visible sighting of the new moon crescent. Hebrew Kodesh, we'll look at that as we go on today, Exodus 12:1-2, and also Psalms 81, verse 3. The Jewish calendar begins each month with the conjunction, also known as a dark moon or as the astronomical new moon, and also, called the astronomical new moon or dark moon. Biblical calendar, when the barley is not yet in the Abib stage, which is a specific phase in its development, it has to have some dough. Has to be roasted minimum, is how we determine that. So by the end of the 12th month, the 13th month is added. This is called a Dar 2. And the reason we do this is it keeps the seasons in line, but it's based on the agriculture. It's based on the agriculture, not by some sort of astronomical calculation or some Jewish invention. So the Jewish calendar provides a calculated 19-year cycle in which it adds a 13th month every 2 to 3 years. So we explain how this works here. So the R, I don't know if you can read this, but it's RRL, RRL, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of it. But basically what it does is every 2 to 3 years, it's calculated. It automatically adds an Adar 2 or 13th month. And again, this way it keeps the seasons in line. And it's pretty good. I have to say it does a pretty good job. But, one of the things that's important to realize is that Yahweh's calendar is not calculated. And there are occasions when this 19-year cycle does not fall in line with Scripture, with the agriculture as we find in Israel. So it's a good system as far as being fairly reliable, but it's not Yahweh's system, so we don't use it. And the last one here is the Bible provides the exact dates for the annual Sabbaths or feasts without exception or deviation. Leviticus 23, Deuteronomy 16 are the main two. And we know that the Jewish calendar contains calculated postponements, ensuring that an annual and weekly Sabbath do not fall consecutively. In other words, one thing you'll see is the Jews will not allow Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, to land with the Sabbath. Because they just, whatever reason, they feel that's unbiblical, even though Yahweh never says that. He never gives a stipulation. So what they will do is they will allow postponements to the calendar to ensure that doesn't happen. So again, these are rules that the Jewish calendar has established. Whereas we're going to see the biblical calendar, as we also see here already, the biblical calendar is based again on observation. As we see in this chart, the new moon crescent begins a month, and also the year is determined by the Abib barley. We're going to see more of this as we go on. Now, how do we know this? How do we know this information? Or really two things. Number one, we know from Scripture, of course. Scripture gives us indication as to when these things begin. The other is scholarship. We find evidence for these things from scholarship, whether it's encyclopedias, dictionaries, or writings from antiquity, which we'll look at all those today. So today we're going to use both in deciphering the biblical calendar, understanding the biblical calendar. I want to begin by asking, though, when does a day begin? If you notice, we say nothing there about the chart, when the day begins, because the Jews actually do that right. They have that right. They know when the Sabbath begins, and they know how to determine when the Sabbath begins. And as we'll see, that's sunset. Now, where do we find this in Scripture? We're no surprise. We see this in the first chapter of Genesis 1, verse 5. I want to begin there. Genesis 1, verse 5. It says, "And Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day." So this is day one by the way of creation. And we see here in day one that Yahweh provides two definitions for the word day. And we'll see this, but it actually comes from the Hebrew yom, day. The first definition is found here in the phrase, "And Elohim called the light day, and the darkness he called night." So we see here that there's a distinction, literally, between the day and the night. That the day is the light portion, and the night is the dark portion. So that is one way Yahweh defines a day. Again, the day is a light portion, the night is the evening, or the dark portion. We also see a second definition here for the word day, where it says in the evening and the morning. That's the second definition. So based on this, we see that the day begins when? The day begins in the evening. The day begins in the evening, then followed by the morning, and that goes through the entire day until the next evening. That is how you determine the 24-hour day, and that's why we start Sabbath when? We start Sabbath sunset on Friday, because that is how Yahweh determines his day. It's the evening before, based on the way we look at time, it's the evening before. So we see here that evening comes before the morning, and this is why, again, we start the biblical day in the evening and not in the morning, as some do. Now, what is the meaning of this word evening here? That's an important word to understand. Really important that we understand the word evening. It comes from the word Arab, and Arab means dusk, and that's based on Strong's. Arab comes from the Hebrew Arab. I think that's a primitive root, or the trilateral root there. It says Arab. It says means to grow dusky as sundown. So that's when the sky begins to be dark. That's Arab, and Arab is sunset or sundown. So we find here that the day begins at sunset, when the sun dips down the horizon. And when that happens, again, the sky begins to grow dusky, as we find through the Hebrew and as we find through observation. So in this passage, again, we see two definitions. One is the day represents the daylight portion. So when it's sunny, right? When it's light. The other instance is from sunset to sunset. This is how Scripture defines the day. And again, this is why we don't observe Sabbath starting. Some people believe that the Sabbath starts at sunrise. because they'll look at the first definition here and say, there's your evidence. Where the problem is, we also see evidence that the day begins at sunset and goes through until the following sunset. This is how we're to observe Sabbath. Think about the penalty for those who broke the Sabbath in the Old Testament. Some people say, or it doesn't matter how you keep the Sabbath. It doesn't matter if you started sunset or sunrise. Of course it matters. We see in the Old Testament that those who broke the Sabbath, that the penalty was death. We see several examples of that. The guy that went out and gathered sticks, of course, I think it was a little bit more than that, but still, he was gathering something he shouldn't have, and he was stoned because he was breaking the Sabbath. So Sabbath is very important. It is critically important to our Father in heaven, and it's for that reason we need to keep it, and we need to keep the entire day, which again begins at sunset, not sunrise. Now we also see evidence for this in the Hebrew from Strong's and other references. So I want to review a few of those with you. So let's look at the evidence. Yom. Again, Yom, that's the Hebrew word for day. And this is from the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. The Strong's is generally just what we say. It says, from an unused root, meaning to be hot, a day has the warm hours, whether literal, and it says from sunrise to sunset, or from sunset to the next. So from sunset to sunset. So we see two different definitions, just as we saw in Genesis 1 verse 5, that Yom refers to the daylight portion, to the hot portion of the day. That's true. But it also refers to from sunset to sunset. We have other references here. This is from Vine's Expository Dictionary of Biblical Words. It defines says Yom has several meanings. And really, I mentioned too, there's other meanings beyond this. We'll see some of those in a moment. It says the word represents the period of daylight is contrasted with nighttime. So again, you have the day portion of the day and you have the night portion of the night, or the dark portion. And it goes on to say the word denotes a period of 24 hours. And we know from Scripture that begins at sunset or evening. We also see something from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. It says, number one, it sometimes means the time from daylight till dark. Again, that's that first definition we find in Genesis 1 verse 5. Goes on to say day also means a period of 24 hours, or the time from sunset to sunset. So there's that definition. In the Bible usage, the day begins with sunset. And we're going to see many of these examples throughout this study, but Leviticus 23:32, Exodus 12:15 through 20, 2 Corinthians 11:25, where night is put before day. One more reference here I want to refer to. This is a Brown Driver and Briggs Hebrew Lexicon. It says day, number one, is a day opposed to night. So again, you have that daylight portion, just as we again saw in Genesis 1 verse 5. B, a day, 24-hour period. Of course, that would begin with sunset. C, days, lifetime. So, we see here also scripturally that day can have a symbolic meaning, or a broad meaning, or a general meaning. It says another one is time period, a general, so just a time period in general, nothing specific. And year. So these are all the possible ways Yom can be rendered, or day can be rendered within a scripture. Now I want to consider the examples we see now in Genesis 1. Genesis 1, because we see a pattern in Genesis 1 that's important to recognize. So number one, Genesis 1 verse 8. Now tell me if you see a pattern. It says, in the evening and the morning were the second day. Verse 13 says, in the evening and the morning was the third day. 1:19 says, in the evening and the morning were the fourth day. Verse 23 says, in the evening and the morning were the fifth day. And lastly here, in the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So what do we see here in every example? What pattern do we find in every example? Where it says here that there was evening and there was morning. So notice that in every example, how Yahweh defines a day. We see again the daylight portion is mentioned in Genesis 1:5, but in every other instance of Genesis 1, when Yahweh defines a day, he says the fifth day, the fourth day, the third day, the second. He always says evening and morning. Evening and morning. So you see, this is how Yahweh defines a day. It begins with the evening and it goes through until that following evening. By the way, boker is the Hebrew for morning. It can mean to extend through the entire day. And I'm not going to look at that, but if you can look at it in your own time if you'd like. But it also has that meaning to include the day and also the daylight portion up until the sunset of the following day. I haven't touched on one fact yet. I really find this intriguing. What came first in creation? Was there darkness or was there light? When we see in Genesis 1, what came first? Darkness or light? Or we know that darkness came first. So we see just the same pattern with creation as we see with the day. Just as we see with creation that there was darkness and then Yahweh created the light, same thing with the day. It begins with darkness. And then the next day we see light. Well, let's now look at Scripture. Scriptural examples showing that evening. Remember evening, Arab, right? Arab means what? Arab means sunset. Sunset. So let's look at some instances, some examples of this. Leviticus 11:31 through 32 says this. These are unclean to you among all that creep. Whatsoever doth touch them, when they are dead, shall be unclean until the even. And upon whatsoever any of them, when they are dead, doth fall, it shall be unclean. Whether it be any vessel or wood or raiment or skin or sack, whosoever or whatsoever vessel it be, therein any work is done. It must be put into water, and it shall be unclean until the even, so it shall be cleansed. So we find here laws dealing with purity and hygiene. Where Yahweh says here that if we touch something unclean, that we're unclean, or that thing is unclean until when? Scripture says that thing is unclean until the evening. The evening. And at evening, we know that that pot or that vessel of whatever it was is then clean after it's washed and after that day has gone by. So we see here that sunset obviously begins a new day. Evening begins a new day. That's why this thing goes from unclean to clean. After it's washed, it is then clean at evening or at that new day. So we see an example of that here. One of the best examples, I think, is the one we see in Leviticus 23. This is in reference to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It says, for whosoever or whatsoever soul, and by the way, soul is nephesh. Some people, they get so confused with the word soul. They read into this immortal soul. That actually comes from Egypt when you look at an immortal soul. It's not a biblical concept. Soul is nephesh. It simply means person. That's all it means. Scripture says 8 souls were saved from the flood. 8 people were saved. It says, whatsoever soul it be that shall not be afflicted. And that day, and the word afflicted there is a na, and it can mean to humble, but we know in the context of Yom Kippur that it refers to fasting. So if a person does not fast on that day, he says, he shall be cut off from among his people. And whatsoever soul it be that does any work in that same day. So notice how precise he is. We also obviously know this is on the 10th day of the 7th month. It says, that same soul will I destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of rest, and you shall afflict your souls. And the 9th day of the month at even, from even unto even, shall you celebrate your Sabbath. So we see here a description again of Yom Kippur. This is the Day of Atonement. By the way, the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur is literally, it means a day of covering. As we heard here recently with the Day of Atonement, this is when Yahweh took the sins of Israel and transferred the sins to the scapegoat or the Azazel, then sent it out into the wilderness. Now, notice how Yahweh defines the timing of Yom Kippur. This is very unique. I don't believe we see anything like this outside of this example. He says here that they were to observe this day from the 9th day of the month at even, from evening to evening. From evening to evening. So what is this saying? Or Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, begins on the end of the 9th day. At the end of the 9th day. And then should be observed from evening to evening. In other words, at the end of the 9th day begins a 10th day, and we're to observe this through the end of that 10th day or until the next evening. Now, what if we were off? And I'm not talking about these people who really don't understand the calendar, believe me. But once we know, and we just choose to ignore it, what's the penalty we see here for the person who just simply ignores the right day? What happens if we do any work on this day, or we refuse to afflict our souls on this day? Or we see here that Yahweh is going to cut us off as his people. So, some say it doesn't matter. It's not that big of a deal. And again, I'm not talking about those who don't understand, but those who do understand, it is a big deal. And we need to do it right. Yahweh is not it's not a buffet. We don't get to choose which ones we observe and which ones we don't. Yahweh says to do it on this day, and that's what we're to do. We all know what happened to old Jeroboam. Jeroboam, he did it his way. And, it's amazing. After Jeroboam, not one king in Israel's history did right. Did you know that? Not one king. Judah had a few good kings intermixed with a lot of bad kings. But Israel, they just went wayward immediately with Jeroboam. And I think Jeroboam had an opportunity. I do, because Yahweh came to Jeroboam, and he says, look, if you obey me, if you do it my way, I'm going to bless you. But he says, if you don't, I'm not. And guess what? He did it his way, because he was afraid for his own neck. And as a result, not only did he lead astray Israel during his reign, but I believe every other king after him followed him in his example. We have one more example I want to look at before the main one. So we also see an example in Judges. Judges 14, 7 through 18, it says, and she wept before him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it came to pass on the 7th day that he told her, because she lay sore upon him. And she told the riddle to the children of her people, and the men of the city said unto him on the 7th day before the sun went down, notice that, what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion? And he said unto them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, that was his wife, or he wasn't real pleased, by the way, with what she did to him, but it says, you had not found out my riddle. We know in this passage, Samson made a wager with the Philistines. He gave them this riddle and said, look, if you can answer this within 7 days, I'll give you some clothing. Now, I want you to notice here, when these Philistines gave Samson the answer to the riddle, remembering that they only had 7 days. If they didn't do it within 7 days, they did not receive the wager. Where it says that the men of the city answered him on the 7th day before what? Before the sun went down. You see, right at the end of the 7th day, they came to him with the answer. And I don't know if it's just timing or why they waited, but we see here that they waited until the very last moment, and then they gave Samson the answer to his riddle. But again, for us, the point here is that this shows that sunset ends and begins a new day. I want to consider one more example for day. This is by far, I think, the most important example we find in Scripture. I found this several years ago. Nehemiah 13, verse 19. It says there, and it came to pass when the gates of Jerusalem began to be dark before the Sabbath. Notice that. What was happening there? Where the gates were growing dark. How do you think that happens? Where the sun was setting. It says, I commanded that the gates should be shut and charged that they should not be opened till after the Sabbath. And some of my servants set I at the gates, that should no burden be brought in on the Sabbath. So here, to prevent the people of Judah from breaking the Sabbath, Nehemiah commanded that the gates of the city be what? Be shut. Be shut for the remainder of the Sabbath. We even see in the story that he threatened force. He said, look, he says, if you continue to hang out here, if you continue to stay outside the gates, he says, I'm going to put you in prison. That's how serious this was. Yeah? He says, I don't even want you near this city. If you're going to sit here by these gates and you're going to wait until the Sabbath is over, he says, I'm going to throw you in ward. So they quickly dispatched after that. They didn't want that penalty. Now, I want you to notice here the phrase, and it began to be dark. Began to be dark. And keep in mind that this is referring to the beginning of the Sabbath. I think the context is very clear with that. It's beginning of the Sabbath, and it says began to be dark. So there's no debate. I want to read a few other translations. Number one, the NIV says when the evening shadows fell on the gates before the Sabbath. So again, the same concept. The Revised Standard says when it began to be dark at the gates before the Sabbath. So again, the same concept. So when the gates were getting dark at the approach of the Sabbath, that's from the New Jerusalem Bible. So what do we see here from all these translations? We see the same message, and that is that it was becoming dark before when? Before the Sabbath. We see undeniable proof, I believe, here when the Sabbath begins. It begins as sunset, because we see here that the shadows were falling. It was becoming dark before the Sabbath. So we see undeniable proof as to when the Sabbath and really the day begins here. I want to transition now, talk about the next measurement, and that is a month. When does the month begin? Or we've already seen through that chart, the month begins with the new moon crescent. How do we know that? How do we know that the month begins with the new moon crescent and not maybe the conjunction as the Jews and others observe today? Or again, we find proof from the Bible and scholarship. So let's look at some of that evidence. Or for me, always a go-to passage is Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. Really, we should all be familiar with this, by the way. Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. I'm going to read the first part. It says, to observe the month of Abib. Observe the month. That's really what I want to focus on here. Observe the month. So let me ask, what does it mean when Scripture says that we're to observe? What does it mean? Or the word comes from shamar. That's a Hebrew word. It means to hedge about, as with thorns. That is, to guard, generally to protect, to attend to. Well, let me ask you something. If we're told to guard something, what do? Do we turn our back and do we ignore it? No, we watch it, right? We watch it. Same thing with the new moon, with a month. We watch it. That's how we observe it. Now, I want to review another reference here because this brings us out a little bit better. The Brown Traveler Briggs Hebrew Lexicon provides 9 different definitions. One is to keep, to have charge of. So again, this is the idea of guarding something. Number 2, to keep, to guard. Notice that, to keep watch and ward, to protect, to save life. Number 3, to watch for, to wait for. So again, this idea of watching. 4, to watch, to observe. 5, to keep, to retain, to treasure up. 6, to keep. 7, to observe, to celebrate, to keep, to perform, which would also certainly apply to the new moon. We know it's a time of convocation. 8, to keep, to persevere, and to protect. And the last one here is to keep or to reserve. So we see here the shamar really, again, conveys this idea of being a watchman, watching. And again, this is how we observe the new moon. We watch for the new moon. We watched for the new moon last night. And several, by the way, saw the new moon in the local area. And I think one or maybe more in Texas also saw the new moon. Now, what is the Hebrew word for month? What's the Hebrew word for month? Well, the word for month comes from the Hebrew kodesh, and it literally means new moon. Now, the word kodesh, the primitive root or trilateral root, comes from the Hebrew kadash, and Strong's defines this as to be new or to rebuild, to be new or to rebuild. So that is a root of kodesh, and kodesh means new moon or month. So Yahweh is commanding here in Deuteronomy 16, verse 1, that we should be watching for the new moon crescent. And by the way, that's one reason why we don't observe the new moon as seen in Israel, because I don't see how you can follow this command and still observe it from Israel, because we're to watch for it, we're to honor it, we're to observe it. And we know that sometimes there's a day difference between us and Israel because of the time difference. Now, again, as we've already talked about, we know that Kodesh is a new moon crescent. It's not the conjunction. It's not the dark moon, as some use. And, this should be pretty obvious based on the definition The conjunction, there's nothing new. There's nothing new. There's nothing there. It's invisible. And by the way, you can actually have a dark moon for 2 to 3 days. I ask some people, which one do you use? Or they say there's only one conjunction, and they're right. They are right. There is only one conjunction, but that doesn't explain the fact also that there's 2 or 3 days where you can have a dark moon. How do you do that? How do you, though, look for something that doesn't exist? How do you look for a conjunction? How do you look for a dark moon? Or you can't. I also want to look at one more example as it pertains to the moon. Exodus 12, verse 2, it says, this month, again, month comes from Kodesh. Kodesh refers to the new moon. Shall be unto you the beginning of months. Again, that's Kodesh, new moon. It shall be the first month or the new moon of the year to you. Yahweh here tells Moses that this month, and the context here, by the way, is it's after the plagues. They're ready to leave Egypt or right before. And Yahweh here, he's saying, look, this month you're in right now. He says this new moon will mark the first new moon or the first month of the year to you. Now again, the word month here is the same word we found in Deuteronomy 16, and that is again Kodesh. And Kodesh again refers to the new moon. So again, what Yahweh is saying here is that this new moon shall be to you the beginning of new moons of the year. Now we know that this new moon marked Abib. Abib, we're going to talk more about Abib in a few moments. Abib is the first biblical month of the year. We also know that this month was when they observed Passover. What would have happened, by the way? Think about this. What would have happened if Moses would have said, hey, it's not that important. I'm going to ignore this first month. What would have happened? Were all those firstborn in those homes would have died, right? Because if they had not applied the blood, they would have died. So it's important that we observe these times when we find scripturally. Or let's look at scholarship. I want to see what scholars say about new moon. And by the way, we actually have an eyewitness from antiquity, which I think is very important. So the first is the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. Great reference, by the way. It says the Hebrew or Jewish calendar had 3 stages of development: the pre-exilic, the biblical, the post-exilic or Talmudic, and the post-Talmudic. The first rested on observation merely. Notice that. What do you think that means, observation merely? What it's saying is that the only form it used was observation. They looked for things. That's what it's saying. They looked for as we're going to see, the barley. They looked for the new moon crescent. That's how they determined the calendar. They weren't trying to figure out all these calculations, seeing where the conjunction was and seeing where this or that was and making sure that this did not fall there so that we would have to add a postponement. No, it was based on observation merely, observation only. No calculation involved. The second on calculation coupled with observation coupled with calculation, it was creeping in. And the third on calculation only, which was really introduced in the 4th century with Hillel II. People don't realize that during the time of the Messiah, they were still observing. They were still looking for the new moon. They were still using the agriculture. They weren't doing what we see today with the Jewish calendar. They weren't doing it. This came later. Goes on to say, in the first period, the priests determined the beginning of each month by the appearance of what? By the appearance of the new moon. What is, by the way, when you say appearance, what does that convey to you? Or here's what it conveys to me. They saw something. They saw something. Again, a conjunction is you can't see. There's nothing to see. It's black. Okay, another one here. Actually, no, this is another reference. This is the New Ungar's Bible Dictionary. It explains how they would determine the new moon. It says, as the festivals, according to the Mosaic law, were always to be celebrated on the same day of the month. Again, like Passover is the 14th day of the month, always 14th day of the month. It was necessary to fix the commencement of the month. This was determined by the appearance of the new moon. Again, what do you do what is it communicating? What is it conveying when it says appearance of the new moon? It's something we see. It's not something we calculate. For the new moon was reckoned not by astronomical calculation. What is a conjunction? The conjunction is an astronomical calculation. We're not to use that. It goes on to say, but by actual personal observation. I love that. I really like how it describes that because number one, it's a personal form of worship, I believe. Some people say, well, it's not real important. I believe it is. I believe looking for the new moons is very important because it's something we personally do, personal observation. And then it explains it. It says, on the 13th day of the month, watchmen were placed on commanding heights around Jerusalem to watch the sky. As soon as each of them detected the moon, or the new moon, he hastened to a house in the city kept for this purpose and was there examined by the president of the Sanhedrin. When the evidence of the appearance was deemed satisfactory, the president stood up and formally announced it, uttering the words, "It is consecrated." And when he said, "It is consecrated," that then would begin a new month. So as the information was immediately sent throughout the land from the Mount of Olives by beacon fires on the tops of the hills, the religious observance of the day of the new moon may plainly be regarded as the consecration of a natural division of time. So to communicate, as we see here, they would actually light beacon fires and it would travel throughout the land of Israel. That was their internet back then. That's how they did things. Okay, another reference here. This is the Encyclopedia Judaica. Very great reference. It's hard to really have a better reference than the Encyclopedia Judaica. And here's what it says. It says, originally, you see, the Jews understand this. One of the things I really find amazing about scholarship, whether it's the Catholics, whether it's the Jews, is they will acknowledge it. They don't hide it. They don't hide it. They're okay with it. You see, they believe they have the authority to change these things. So they will be truthful with you. They'll say, yeah, this is the way it originally worked. It says originally the new moon was not fixed by astronomical calculation, but was solemnly proclaimed after witnesses had testified to the reappearance of the crescent of the moon. So there it is, the crescent of the moon. Not the conjunction of the moon, not the darkness of the moon, the crescent of the moon. It says by the middle of the 4th century, the sages, and really Hillel II was the one who really pushed this, had established a permanent calendar and the public proclamation of the new moon was discontinued. By the way, did you realize that there's a quasi-Sanhedrin now established? I say quasi because there's so many Jewish groups that most don't recognize this Sanhedrin, but they're calling themselves a Sanhedrin. Guess what they're doing? They're going out and looking for the new moon, just like they did during biblical times. And I read an article with a guy that did this, and he was shocked. He said, so much harder, but he also said there's so much more meaning when you look for the new moon. You see, he gets it. When you go out and do it, you realize it. When you don't do it, you just sort of, you don't realize it. So anyway, just as a side note there's actually some Jews now coming back, returning, if you will, to the old ways. So we see this. One more reference here. This is the Philo, the works of Philo, page 23. It says, at the time of the new moon, the sun begins to illuminate the moon with a light which is visible. So notice that. And by the way, this is an antiquity eyewitness account. It says light which is visible to the outward senses, and then she displays her own beauty to the beholders. And I'll read a little bit here. Philo of Alexandria, 20 to 50 CE, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. Philo used philosophical allegory to harmonize Jewish scripture, mainly the Torah, with Greek philosophy. His method followed the practices of both Jewish exegesis and Stoic philosophy. Not a guy we need to emulate, by the way. But, he was there. He understood how the Jews did it. He knew what a new moon was. And he describes a new moon right here. He says, when the light which is visible, this is not the conjunction. There's nothing visible with the conjunction. So again, Philo, 20 to 50 CE, probably during the time of the Messiah when he was real young anyway, and confirming when and how the Jews would determine the new moon. So we see here, number one, that the biblical calendar is based on what? It's based on personal observation. You see, we do something, we look for it, we watch it. That's how Yahweh determines his calendar. It's not by calculation. It's not taking this long arithmetic or this spreadsheet and plugging in all the numbers and hopefully, we will understand when these days fall. No, he says we do this by observation. And again, the modern Jewish calendar is not the biblical calendar. I wish other Sabbath and feast keepers would understand this. They keep the feast, but they're doing it based on the Jewish calendar. And the Jewish calendar is not the biblical calendar. The Jews will admit this. It's not hard to find. It's not hard to find. And number two, the biblical month was determined, as we see here, by the first visible crescent of the new moon. So we see undeniably from Scripture and from scholarship how the month was determined, and that was through the new moon crescent, not the conjunction. Well, I want to transition now and talk about how we determine the year. So we've talked about the day, we've talked about the month. Let's talk about this last component here, and that is the year. How do we do this? Or some say that we're to use the vernal equinox to determine the beginning of the year. For those who may not be familiar with this, I'm going to define it from the Cambridge Dictionary. It says there that the equinox, or the vernal equinox, is when the time in the spring when the sun crosses the equator and when night and day are of equal length. It is an astronomical calculation that begins the spring. From an astronomical standpoint. Now, where in the Bible does it talk about the equinox? Where in the Bible does it mention the word equinox? Where in the Bible does it mention the concept of the equinox? Where in the Bible does it mention the notion of the equinox? Or many who believe this will point to Genesis 1:14. So let's look at that. Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. It says, "And Elohim said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." Now, the word season, I want to define this real quickly. It comes from the Hebrew moed. Moed, important word to remember. Strong's defines this as an appointment that is a fixed time or season, specifically a festival, conventionally a year, by implication an assembly. So has a few different definitions, but generally is connected with Yahweh's feast days. So notice here that Yahweh mentions both the day and the night, and he says that these items are to be used for signs, seasons, days, and years. Now, those who believe in the equinox will use this to say that the mention here of the sun in reference to in connection with the word season or moed proves that we're to begin the year with the equinox. So let me explain that again, because I'm as clueless as you are when it comes to this. The mention of the sun in conjunction with the word season or moed proves that we're to use equinox. Or that's the reasoning anyway. Now, in my humble opinion, interpreting the equinox here is going way beyond the evidence we find within this passage. Now, they also refer to, or many will refer to Exodus 34. Exodus 34:22, and it says there, "And thou shalt observe the Feast of Weeks of the first fruits of the wheat harvest." Again, Pentecost represents a wheat harvest. And the Feast of Ingathering, which is Tabernacles, by the way, for those who don't know, this is at the year's end. At the year's end. Now, the claim here is the word end refers to the equinox. In the Hebrew, it's takutfa. We explain this in the Restoration Study Bible. It says, there the word end is from the Hebrew takutfa, which some have interpreted as referring to the autumnal equinox, or just equinox generally speaking. This interpretation is of later rabbinical interpretation. The proper rendering of takutfa within the context of this passage is the end of the agricultural year. The Feast of Tabernacles marked the ingathering of the remaining crops for that year. Takutfa, by the way, literally means it's a cycle. That's all it is. It's a cycle. And we see that, Yahweh's a lot of cycles. So here we again see a cycle, but it has nothing to do with, number one, what time are we talking about here, by the way? Are we talking about the spring, or are we talking about the fall? Where it says at the end of the year after Tabernacles, or this is referring to the fall time of the year. So let's say this is referring to the equinox, which again, this is of later rabbinic interpretation, but it's not referring to the vernal equinox, it's referring to the autumnal equinox. But again, we know that's not the case either. This is not referring to the equinox. It's simply referring to a cycle of time, if you look at the Hebrew. A cycle of time, not to the equinox. So again, we don't see any proof. And I wish I could give you some more examples, but there are no other examples really people use to prove the equinox. It just isn't there. I believe that the equinox came into play during the time the Roman Church used the vernal equinox to establish Easter. How many people knew that? The Roman Church uses the equinox to determine the timing of Easter. Do you know why they do it the way they do it? Because they don't want Easter and Passover to fall together. You see, they wanted nothing to do with anything Jewish. So they wanted to make sure that there was a distinction between the Passover and their Easter. So while the Jews were doing it this way, they said, you know what, we'll use the equinox. And we'll make sure that they don't fall at the same time. Where I believe that this is really when the equinox came into vogue and really when the equinox began to be used as a measurement for time. But again, Scripture doesn't use it for anything. It's not mentioned. The concept of an equinox, as far as a rabbinic sense, this is a post-Scripture. Post-Scripture. Okay, I want to look at Deuteronomy 16, verse 1 more time. It says there, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto Yahweh Elohim. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh Elohim brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Now, again, we've already seen this once, right? But now we're going to look at it again. Now, but this time I want to focus on one word, and that is Abib. It says that we're to observe the month of Abib. Now, we know that observe is shamar, right? To look for. We know that month is Kodesh, means new moon. Now we see Abib. Abib. You know, so many people, they read this with never realizing what they're reading. So we see how we're to begin the biblical year. Now, it may not be obvious quite yet, but this is how we begin the biblical year. To make sure we all understand the meaning here, I want to spend just a few moments looking at this word Abib. So let's do that. So the Strong's, here's how it defines Abib. It says, from an unused root, meaning to be tender, that is green, or green, that is a young ear of grain, hence the name of the month of Abib or Nisan. Nisan, by the way, came after, or within the Babylonian captivity. They adopted many of the Babylonian ways, and Nisan is one example of that. But here we see that Abib is rendered or understood as what? Number one is green, is young, and it refers to what? It refers to grain. Okay. The Brown Driver and Briggs Hebrew Lexicon says, month of air forming, of greening of crops, is green because it's maturing. Of growing green Abib, the month of the Exodus and the Passover. Now, this third one, I really like how it defines. I think out of all of them, this one really comes the closest in defining Abib from a scriptural standpoint. It says, barley that is already ripe, listen to that, barley that is already ripe, but still soft, the grains which are eaten, either rubbed or roasted. Rubbed or roasted. You see, there has to be some sort of dough in that head. And that generally occurs during the soft or hard dough stage of the barley. And when you have that, what you can do is you can actually roast the barley and you can partake of it that way. It's not quite fully ripe yet, but as soft as it says here. But again, we see what kind of grain, by the way, through this reference, barley, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay, Wilson's Old Testament Word Studies, this is the last one. It says, the name of the month, so called because corn. Now, corn, by the way, if you're confused, that's Old English for grain. They don't have corn as we do here in this country, it's grain. Then, it was then forming in the ear. So, it's talking about the dough, the dough. See, it starts off with just like water, and then dough begins to form. And when you have that dough, then you can roast, and that qualifies in as Abib. But you have to have something. You see, if it's just water in there's nothing to roast. That's not Abib. Abib, you have some dough that you can roast. That's Abib, and then anything after that, obviously. It says that the ear was then forming in the ear a few weeks before harvest. Notice that. And keep in mind, by the way, I don't really focus on this. All of this is for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, for this Omer offering. You had to have enough for the Omer offering. That's kind of a different study, but I'll just say this. Some people have this notion, this crazy notion, that you have to have like entire fields ready by the wave sheaf or by Abib. That's not the case. All you need scripturally is enough for the wave sheaf offering, which is what we use here. Anyway, it says a few weeks before harvest, falling somewhere about March or April, afterwards called Nisan, again, adopted by the Babylonians, the first month of the Hebrew year. So in all these references, we find one undeniable fact. Abib does not refer to the equinox. By the way, did you see it once? Did you see the word equinox? Did you see the word maybe astronomical calculation? It's not there because the word Abib, so if we want to understand when the year begins, we need to understand Abib. That's the clue. It all hinges on this word Abib. Abib. And Abib, again, refers to grain and specifically to barley and not to the equinox or not to any type of astronomical calculation. Let's go back to Deuteronomy 16:1. I want to sort of interject the meanings of the Hebrew here. It says, so look or observe, right? Look for the month, new moon, look for the new moon of what? Of Abib, it says. But what does it mean? It says young ears of grain. That's the literal rendering of Deuteronomy 16:1. Look for the new moon of young ears of grain. That is how we determine the beginning of months. That is how we determine the first month of Yahweh's year, because we know that this here is referring to the first month. That's the month of Passover. And we've seen through Strong's and through other lexical aids the meaning of Abib, and we see that it refers to young ears of grain. We saw even one reference mentions barley, but how do we know from a scriptural standpoint that Abib refers to barley? Well, Scripture actually shows that. Did you know that? Scripture shows that Abib refers to barley. Well, let's look at an example. Exodus 9, verse 31. It says, and the flax and the barley was smitten, for the barley was in the ear, and that word ears is Abib, and the flax was bold. So this passage, by the way, speaking about the destruction from the seventh plague of Egypt, and we see here that the barley was in what? It says here that the barley was in the ear. Now, this word ears, again, Abib. So this passage is literally in the Hebrew saying the barley was in Abib. So that's how we know when to begin the year. But we know that this was just literally days before Israel would go free. This was days before Exodus 12, verse 2, where Yahweh says that this month shall be unto you the beginning of months. You see, when Yahweh told Moses this, the barley, as we see here in Exodus 9, verse 31, was already Abib. Do you understand that connection? So in Exodus 9, verse 31, we see here that the barley was an Abib, that it was young, it was tender. And then if we scroll past this to Exodus 12, verse 2, we find then that the new moon, that following new moon, marked the new year. So this is how we determine the biblical year. We have Abib barley, followed with the new moon crescent. Now, I will say this just real quickly. Some believe out there that you can project the barley. That, in other words, because again, it has everything to do with the wave sheaf. So if they believe the barley will be Abib by the wave sheaf, they'll go ahead and say it's the month of Abib. We don't do that here for the record. What we do is you have to have Abib barley by that new moon crescent. And if you do not have Abib barley by that new moon crescent, we do not commence the month of Abib. We do not project. Because Abib in the agricultural cycle is based on rain and environmental factors. And if those change, those projections may be wrong. So we don't take any chances. And again, the scriptural example is this. There was Abib barley and then the new moon crescent. That's a series of events. That's how it occurs in Scripture. So that's what we do today. You have Abib barley followed with the new moon crescent. And that new moon crescent then would mark Abib 1, or the first month of the year. 14 days from that new moon would then mark the Passover memorial, and it goes from that point. I want to look at two more references confirming what I just stated. Again, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says Abib is not properly a name of the month. And that's true. It's really not a name. It's a description. It's a description of what occurs during that month. It says, but part of a descriptive phrase in the month of young ears of grain. So you see it understands the meaning of Abib. It says this may indicate the Israelitish way of determining the year beginning with the new month, nearest or next, preceding the stage of the growth of the barley. And again, scripturally, what do we see? Scripturally, based on Exodus 9, verse 31, the barley was an Abib, and then Exodus 12, verse 2, the crescent occurred. So the barley is first, then the crescent. Okay, one more. The New Unger's Bible Dictionary says, the months began with a new moon, but the first month was fixed after the Exodus and by the necessities of the Passover. You see, you have to do that so you know when the Passover is. It says, by the ripening of the earliest grain, namely barley. So we find verification here too that the Abib barley, in connection with the new moon crescent, would begin the first biblical month. I want to summarize what we've learned today. Okay, in summary, we begin the day with sunset as seen in our local location, right? We begin the month with a crescent new moon as seen in our own nation. So we observe the crescent anywhere here in this nation. And third, we begin the year with the Abib barley as grown in Israel. Now, by the way, we observe the barley in Israel because, A, barley doesn't grow everywhere, so that's an issue for those who don't have barley. The other thing, too, is barley is native to Israel, and the big reason is we need to have one uniform year. And if we observed barley elsewhere, we would not have one uniform year. So we observe barley based on the growth in Israel. Again, why is all this important? We talked about this. Why is this important? Again, Yahweh's very specific as to when we're to honor him during his feast days. Again, he says 14th day, 15th day, whatever it is. He's very, very specific as to when we're to honor him. And he says, like with Passover, those who did not apply the blood, their firstborn died. For Yom Kippur, those who work during Yom Kippur, those who eat or refuse to afflict their souls on Yom Kippur, he says, you're cut off. So we believe that these days are very important. Paul said in Philippians 2, verse 12, that we were to work out our own salvation in fear and trembling. Also, Peter in 1 Peter 3:15 says that we're to have a ready answer to all who might ask. So as believers, I believe we have an obligation to understand the word. And that includes how and when we worship our Father in heaven. So I pray that this message has been a blessing, somewhat eye-opening to you. Understand maybe better the way the biblical calendar works, some insight maybe you did not have before. And as we leave today, I would encourage you to always focus on Yahweh, focus on his word, focus on him, and I wish you all a very, very blessed week, and may Yahweh bless you.